Well, let's get some perspective on where we are in the NAFTA renegotiations from Peter Clark. He's the president of Gray Clark She and Associates and an international trade expert. He joins me once again from Washington. Mr. Clark, good to see you again. Thanks for being with me.
Hi, Peter.
There seems to be somewhat of an air of optimism around the NAFTA renegotiations this week. Do you share that optimism?
Well, ministers have to be optimistic if they're going into the negotiation because they can't go in thinking they're going to get the stuffing beat out of them. So they have to be optimistic. Watching what's going on, talking to whoever will talk to us, I think that the optimism is perhaps a bit misplaced, perhaps a bit premature. The best I think we can do with something just short of a miracle is to wrap it up by, say, Saturday. If we don't do it then, it's probably 2019 or never.
Okay. The minister used the analogy, the metaphor yesterday of labor and contraction, saying that, you know, with each contraction we get closer, as if to suggest it's slow going, but it's coming and we're going to get there. But you don't seem to be feeling quite that way.
Well, as a father of 6, I'm very well aware of the concept of false labor, and that may be what's happening here. Mexico is still pretty far apart with the United States on automotive rules of origin, and Canada has its problems too. And then we really haven't gotten into a lot of the other issues that have to be resolved. We can't just do an auto pact that favors the United States. It has to be a broad agreement. You have to have critical mass in order to sell it to the legislatures in all 3 countries.
How big is this? So what are you hearing about where we are on the auto piece? Has it largely become a fight now between Mexico and the USA?
The biggest hang-up on automotive is that the United States wants to link the rules of origin to wages. And Mexico considers that that is an affront to their independence and to their national dignity. They don't think the United States should be dictating wages in Mexico.
Many of the observers, a lot of them, say that above all else, there's pressure on the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer to come to at least a partial deal because of the upcoming midterm elections in the U.S. and the Mexican elections coming up as well. It would give President Trump something to put before a Congress which is more favorable to his plans, perhaps. That's not enough, in your opinion, to ensure that we get a deal here, right?
Incredibly dangerous, because if you agree to a package that helps the president and helps the Republicans in the next election, there's no guarantee you'll revisit the rest of it. So I don't see that as being a balanced package.
And you've also suggested that it's Robert Lighthizer's upcoming negotiations with China which ensure that he can't make compromises. But others are saying that it's those upcoming talks, which means the Trump administration wants to get some kind of a deal on NAFTA so it can then focus on China. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that Lighthizer has to be very careful about what he does in NAFTA because the Chinese are watching very closely what he does in that arena and also in the steel and aluminum tariffs negotiations. They are studying it very, very carefully. I've had discussions with Chinese officials who are trying to follow NAFTA. And they'll pick up and use everything they can because they're in a serious situation too.
Let me ask you about this. Does it make sense to come up with some kind of and trumpet some kind of a partial deal and say that you'll get to the other stuff later? Is that a possibility?
Well, it has to be a pretty detailed one, and it has to be pretty clear where it's going for everybody. Now, Lighthizer's approach is this is a rebalancing. The United States is at the short end of the stick, and everybody else has to contribute to leveling the playing field. But there's no need for the United States to give anything to Canada or Mexico. That just can't be sold.
So if we go through this week and they don't have a deal, don't have an agreement in principle, maybe not next week either, where do you think we're headed?
I think that they would have to hoist the negotiations until after the midterm elections. Lighthizer doesn't want to do that because he doesn't know what the composition of Congress is going to be at that time. And it might be more difficult to sell because Congress might have different priorities at that time.
What's the threat to Canadian business here? I mean, there's clearly the issue of uncertainty, but if there isn't some kind of a deal in the next couple of weeks and it gets put off, how bad is that for Canadian companies?
It really depends on whether or not the U.S. Pulls the plug on steel and aluminum tariffs. If
Right.
we have to face those tariffs, it's a terrible complication and a terrible hit on the Canadian economy. So it will be one set of activities if we just continue as is and leave the decisions off until next year. But if we're dealing with the steel and aluminum issue, it's going to be very, very complicated.
And what's your feeling if there's no deal by June 1st, which is the extension Canada got from the U.S. before any tariffs would be implemented? If there's no deal by June 1, would it be your expectations that the Americans would then slap us with the tariffs?
It would be incredibly stupid if they did that, but it's possible.
All right, lots to watch for. As always, Peter Clark, thanks for your input. We'll talk again.
Thank you, Peter.